Welcome to Constructing the Carolinas, a show where we explore the growth of our communities, cities, and counties across North Carolina and figure out what's on the horizon. We are brought to you by Barnhill, which has been constructing the Carolinas since 1949. I'm your host, Valerie Bono, Director of Business Development. Today, I'm joined by Patrick Woodie, President and CEO of the North Carolina Rural Economic Development Center. Patrick has dedicated his career to empowering our state's rural communities, helping them access capital, improve infrastructure, rebuild after disasters, and adapt to major economic shifts. In this conversation, we'll get into how rural areas are strengthening their economies, supporting small businesses, encouraging vibrant downtowns, and building the kind of infrastructure that will sustain them for generations to come. If you've ever wondered what makes rural North Carolina tick and how these communities are evolving in a rapidly changing world, this is the episode for you. So Patrick has been with the Rural Economic Development Center for 18 years, and as a whole, the organization has been around for almost 40 years.
This state has undergone tremendous change from 1987 to today. We've nearly doubled in population. So we were about 6.5 million people when we opened our doors. When we opened our doors, about 58% of the state was considered rural by our definition. Today, it's about 36% of the state is considered rural. And it's 78 counties. And we were 85 counties in the beginning. So our state's undergoing a lot of change. People are coming here from all over the world and all around the country. It's perceived as a really good place to do business, high quality of life. I think the blend of rural and urban and suburban is what makes North Carolina so attractive, and the mountains and the coast. But we do all of our work with an understanding that not all places are created equal, and smaller places that have fewer people, less density of population, have less economic activity, and the needs of those communities are different from the needs of our larger urban centers. The policy that will really help a Charlotte and a Raleigh or a Triangle is probably not the policy that's going to help really small places. And so we try to be the voice for those really small places. We also try to be a bridge between urban, suburban, and rural. We think all are equally important, all contribute to really building a vibrant state that we live in. And we try to really nurture and take care of and look after our piece of that.
I love that. I love that you're a voice for those counties that, are rural, right?
Yeah.
And as a former economic developer, too, you also have a different lens and perspective that you're able to offer them. So I think it's really powerful to serve the communities.
Yeah. We have a saying, when you've seen one rural county, you've seen one rural county.
Right.
And there's a lot of truth to that, because as you go from the mountains to the coast and you travel around our state, you see every place is unique. Every place has unique assets. And we really believe economic development happens when you build upon those local assets and you build around those local assets. And we try to help community leaders see that and be able to understand and articulate what their unique assets are and help them think about how they can use that to improve the quality of life.
Yeah. How are some of the ways that you help them realize their unique needs?
So I would say in a variety of ways. We always have been an organization that actually, capital access is a huge issue for the state and businesses in our state. Rural communities are more reliant on small businesses and smaller businesses than urban areas. And so we've tried to focus a lot of our attention on improving capital access for small and very small businesses wherever they're located in rural North Carolina. And we've been able to really do that through a microenterprise loan program. We run a statewide initiative called the State Small Business Credit Initiative. It works in urban and suburban areas. We partner with banks, credit unions, and community development financial institutions to really do that work. But it also works in very small places. And I think because we do that work statewide, about 45, 50% of our total activity is in the rural parts of the state. And I think it's our unique understanding that allows us to really work on an issue like capital access.
Yeah.
And we're looking, we run a pretty robust policy agenda with the North Carolina General Assembly and with our state congressional delegation, really focused on what are those policy choices, what are line item appropriations that really are critical to rural communities and to building their long-term future.
You've been involved with the Rural Center for quite some time, and I'm curious what you see as the biggest opportunity for rural communities are. And I know that may vary, but if there's anything that stands out to you as a
Yeah, like I say, we try to work real hard to help communities understand their assets. And we often find that it takes an external perspective for people to sometimes recognize what is unique and valuable about their place because they take it for granted. And so I think we can be part of community conversations that do help them see their community in a new way and through a new light. Specifically, recently in terms of what do I think is opening some real opportunity for rural communities, it is ironically the pandemic. And it is a national trend. We see it in North Carolina. We see it in other places around the globe. But after years of really pretty concentrated population flow from rural areas to more urban areas, we've seen that really slow down. The last decade in North Carolina, we saw a slowing of the different, urban and suburban are growing faster than rural, but it's more equalized than it's been in a long, long time. And we went from 53, we actually at one point before 2020, we had 53 counties in the state of North Carolina that were losing population. All 53 of those were rural counties. Pandemic happens, people start to think about, some of the challenges of really densely populated areas. They start to vote with, vote with their feet, by moving to less denser populated places, maybe making a vacation home a permanent home, or just picking up and really moving to a smaller community because of the things that smaller communities offer. And we've certainly seen that in the state of North Carolina, and we've seen after 20 years of population loss, if you look at the last 3 years, we see population growth in rural North Carolina. We're down to only 14 North Carolina counties that have lost population.
Oh, wow.
And among the fastest growing counties in the state of North Carolina are rural counties that are urban adjacent or metropolitan adjacent. We also see, kind of the characteristics of that, of where that is happening. It's not everywhere, and it's not in the most isolated rural parts of the state. But if a family that's considering moving to a smaller place, if they can answer the question of how do I feel about the local K-12 school system? How do I feel about the local healthcare delivery system? Is there robust, affordable broadband available in this community? Those three buckets, more than anything else, if they can check those boxes and get comfortable with those boxes, then we see those communities growing.
Sure. Do you find that the ability to work remote has also helped?
Definitely.
Yeah.
And I think from what we see, while there is some more of a return to the workplace, it's not a going back to the way things were before the pandemic. And I know that's true of our own organization. And it gives workers more flexibility, which also gives them a lot more autonomy about where they do live and where they do choose to make a home. And still, if that technology's there, and if they have a type of job that really lends itself to remote work, they can live in pretty rural places and have a different life than they would have in a big urban place.
Yes. Yeah, that's a really interesting trend, and I'm glad you shared that.
Yeah.
I think that's something, if there was ever a silver lining, the pandemic was terrible, but perhaps that is a silver lining that
That is one of the positive outcomes
Right.
that I think we can tie directly to COVID. The negative one is that, the death rate for rural
Yes.
communities was double what it was for urban communities. And that has to do with a lot of factors.
Sure.
One, the rural population has greater health challenges than the urban population. We also have an older population. Yes. And among those older folks are more health challenges. So it's all understandable, but it is part of what we deal with in our world, and one of the reasons why rural health is so important in our advocacy framework.
Absolutely. Well, let's talk a little bit about the mission and core values.
Sure, yeah.
So the Rural Center's mission is to enhance the quality of life for rural residents, and it's been the cornerstone since 1987, as you mentioned.
Yeah.
So how does this mission align with the broader economic infrastructure throughout the overall needs within the communities?
Yeah, so we really take a very holistic approach of what is economic development. And I mentioned our Rural Economic Development Institute. So our core rural economic development curriculum teaches our students that and our professionals that there are 4 building blocks of the local economy: and workforce development, business development, civic and social infrastructure, and physical infrastructure. And that really you've got to give a community has to be thinking about all those things at the same time. And they all intersect, and they all are dependent upon each other. And if you're weak in one area, it's going to affect other areas. And so if you can think about your community in kind of that comprehensive, using that framework, you can really go about, strengthening all aspects of your community and creating the right conditions in which investment can happen and job creation can happen. And that's the framework we try to give to our communities. We try to offer them programming, offer them support in working to bring about those kind of changes in their community.
Are you working with local community colleges as well?
Yes, community colleges. So we higher capacity organizations like the community college. We call those anchor institutions. Rural communities are always challenged with 3 things. One is leadership. There's fewer people, therefore there's fewer leaders. So a very common thing that you will hear, and even laughter shared among people that talk about this in a rural setting, is as a rural leader, you will find yourself sitting around a lot of different tables within the community wearing different hats, but you're sitting with the same people around these different tables. Just because fewer people, not everybody is willing or going to step up and really take leadership roles in the community. So the folks that do usually end up wearing multiple hats. So we're always trying to figure out and expand that leadership base and leadership opportunity for people. Second is sustainability. Are we able to sustain the things that our community needs? Whether you're a business owner trying to meet the needs of your customers, you're a nonprofit trying to meet the needs of the people you serve, you're a local government trying to meet the needs of your citizens, can we sustain the level of activity that we need in order to really do a good job of taking care of folks and getting the work done? And then the third thing is capacity. Fewer people, less densely populated areas. Not only is it there's a financial dimension to that. So there's less money, there's less capital to invest with, and there's less human capital to invest with. And so rural communities are always trying to solve for leadership capacity and sustainability. And we try to help them think about that and use our building blocks as a framework for how they go about solving those things.
Sure. So why is cultural value important to the economic and physical growth in North Carolina?
I think oftentimes the cultural value of a place relates directly to the assets that they bring to the table and the way in which they can find a pathway to some growth opportunities. And those opportunities look different in different places, but every place has real inherent value and has ways in which they can build the economy, even if it's around some of that local culture areas. A few years back, going back to the 1990s, there was an organization in Western North Carolina that kind of suddenly emerged called Handmade in America. And it was an epiphany for a lot of communities because the craft, the music, pottery, woodworking, quilting, things that had been with people in those communities for generations. Suddenly it was recognized that there's real economic value here. There are people around the world that value those craft items and will pay for those, and we can build a tourism economy around those. We can build a manufacturing economy around those in some cases.
Are there any crafts that come to mind that stand out to you that you've seen across our state in some of these rural communities?
Certainly the pottery.
Yeah.
You find it all across the state, and it varies from the central part of the state and where there's a lot of potters located to the western mountains of North Carolina. Yeah. Some of it very high-end product now. The way in which some of our smaller rural communities have used quilts to decorate they've painted quilt squares to put on the front of their barns.
Oh, really?
And then created driving tours in the community around seeing all the different quilt patterns on all the barns in the community. And then that, word of mouth, and, that takes on a life of its own in terms of, helping them build a tourism identity.
Absolutely. I love that. I love the tourism component, but it's also tying into the craftsmanship that they have.
Yeah.
So earlier you mentioned that there's 78 rural counties. I'm curious, and this is about identifying that a county is in fact rural. Like, what are some of the classifying ways that you say that a county is rural?
So our definition is pretty straightforward.
Okay.
It's based upon population density. We think that population density is the most important defining characteristic of what makes a rural place a rural place. North Carolina is a very county-centric state. We tend to think in counties. In fact, I've noticed one way you can tell a native-born North Carolinian from a newcomer to our state is to ask them, where they live or where they're from. A native North Carolinian is more likely to tell you what county they're from than the town or city that they're from. And so our definition is based upon a county-level definition of population density. There are 78 North Carolina counties that have less than 250 people per square mile, and that's been our definition over our 38 years. There are another 16 counties that are greater than 250 but less than 750 per square mile, and we call those suburban or regional city counties. So that's places like Greenville and Pitt County, Fayetteville and Cumberland County, Asheville and Buncombe County, Davidson and Lexington, places like that. And then there are 6 core urban counties that have population densities that are well over 750 people per square mile. Ours is one definition of rural. You look at different federal agencies that serve rural, and you realize pretty quickly that the definition of rural can become a theological debate quickly.
Yes.
But we take a pretty simple definition. We think that is a framework that really works for North Carolina. Given that framework, we're at a really unique place in our state. Roughly a third of our folks live in rural, a third live in urban, and a third live in suburban. And we've never been at that place before in the history of the state. So it's a pretty interesting time.
Yes. So we just talked about classifying rural counties. I'm curious from a population density standpoint, and also acknowledging this is a Constructing the Carolinas podcast, how does population density impact construction projects that are happening across the state?
Well, we're seeing growth pressures all across the state. We periodically we're having discussions with our network, and our network's pretty diverse. It's, businesses, it's chambers of commerce, economic developers, local governments, it's the faith community. Rural churches are always a part of what we consider the network that we serve, nonprofits, healthcare. So it's pretty comprehensive. And we just finished a 15-stop listening tour with our advocacy team going around the state. We had a listening session within about a 45-minute drive of every rural person and really do a lot of listening. And, so what we're hearing is, I'm sure, a lot of what the construction industry knows. There's huge housing concerns in our state in terms of the unmet need. And for rural, it looks a little different, and it even looks a little different within rural depending upon where you are. In some cases, really concerned about the aging stock of some of our homes and existing houses, and how do you rehab that? Can you rehab that? Upgrade that? But we have housing needs in the most rural places in this state, and we have huge housing needs in the most urban parts of this state. There's real growth opportunity there. One of the things we're doing with our small business capital programming is trying to figure out how can we take some of our capital and dedicate it to single-family and multifamily housing projects that are happening in rural communities. And is there a need? And the answer to that, from what we know so far, is yes, there is. So that the rural center can put some funding into the capital stack to really make those projects happen, and to hopefully bring some other partners to the table that also are willing to put some of their own skin in the game. And that's one of the ways that we're tackling that. From an high-level economic development standpoint, for the last several years, our General Assembly and economic development partners in North Carolina we focused a lot on building the mega sites and building these really huge industrial parks that are capable of accommodating the biggest investment and job creation projects literally on the planet. And there's not many of those, but North Carolina's done a really good job in the last several years of landing a number of those. And now, we're really part of making an argument that, okay, we also need to be thinking about sites and buildings in smaller places that will never be home to a mega site. In the Western Mountains of North Carolina, a mega site isn't possible given the topography. And maybe at some point we'll talk a little bit about the devastation of Helene that's happened in the western part of the state. But and in the eastern part of the state, which the east is big, it's flat, it can be developed, but small sites, small buildings are definitely one of the ways in which those regions are going to attract investment and attract new job creation. And so we need to see the state make an investment not just in the infrastructure of mega sites, but in the infrastructure of those smaller sites and buildings around the state. And then, that translates into the construction industry, coming in and helping to develop that out when those opportunities arise.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, we've heard, Chatham County has a lot of economic development going on, but it seems like with the infrastructure they're still catching up with some of the great needs that they have. Mm-hmm. And then I know you mentioned with the pandemic, people are moving to places that perhaps were once a vacation spot, right, but there continues to be an uptick in needs of facilities such as fire station, EMS, right, and services like that. And
we see a lot of downtown development, mm-hmm, downtown redevelopment, yes, bringing people back into the heart of some of our smaller towns. In the early part of this century, probably our peak employment in rural North Carolina was in the late 1990s. We went through a couple, of recessions, and we shed 350,000 manufacturing jobs, more than any other state in the country. That process over, about 15 years, there's not a town in this state, big or small, that wasn't directly impacted by that. Some have transitioned quickly to kind of redeveloping from that. But over time, we see that redevelopment really spreading, and our real, small towns becoming kind of a focal point for creating community, recreating that sense of community, bringing people to live in the heart of downtowns, redeveloping that business district that maybe has really struggled at times, in the last 20 years. And that's really good to see, that kind of investment coming back.
Absolutely. Well, speaking of investment, and you did just bring up the hurricane relief efforts, what has been some of your involvement with helping the efforts that are needed for the counties that just face complete devastation?
Yeah, there's several things that we try to do immediately when something like that happens. One is make sure we're helping to get out good information from trusted sources, and being one of a lot of different organizations that are doing that. I personally, I don't think we've ever experienced the level of disinformation that was going on during the immediate aftermath of Helene. Certainly was concerning, certainly slowed things down, could even have been life-threatening, and I don't think that's an exaggeration to say. But something we definitely need to pay attention to as we think about the next disaster. So sharing information is really key. One piece that we've always paid attention to is the small business recovery. You want to try to minimize the number of businesses that make a decision to close. And you do that pretty quickly by seeing how, by trying to quickly get some money into the pockets of business owners that allow them to move forward the day after the rain stops or the event is over. And we started after Matthew, and through several storms ran a emergency bridge loan program for small businesses that enables them to get cash quickly, that they can meet payroll, they can clean up, they can maybe get reopened, minimize the downtime, take away some of the uncertainty from their lives. It takes a while for federal and state resources to start flowing. So we try to be those first dollars on the ground for small businesses. With Helene, one organization, a CDFI called Mountain BizWorks, really it was the heart of their footprint in Western North Carolina. And so they really have been the focal point of that small business recovery. We've tried to support them in every way that we could. We sent capital to them to really get them started with the bridge loan program. What I can tell you is we've never seen anything like this. We've seen a lot of devastating storms hit eastern North Carolina that have been incredibly bad, but we've never seen anything like kind of the concentrated devastation of Helene in western North Carolina. Where that really came home for me was I was recently with the South Carolina and North Carolina Secretaries of Transportation. And the question was asked, what is the damage just to roads and bridges in your state? And the South Carolina Secretary, his answer was $50 million in road and bridge damage in the state of South Carolina from Helene. The number in Western North Carolina is $5 billion.
Wow.
We have 2 road projects, and one of them is not an interstate highway that probably have over $1 billion price tags to the rebuilding of those roads. And then the question becomes rebuild how? And, obviously you want it to be more resilient. You want it to withstand the next devastating storm that comes along. And, as a native Western North Carolinian, if you had asked me in August, I would have said one of the safest places in this country to be from a climate change perspective and from a path of devastating weather events, which our country sees more and more of year in and year out. I would have said Western North Carolina is one of the safest places you could be. but it turns out it's not. If the right events come together in just that way, we're going to be many years rebuilding. It will not be the same. It will come back. One of the things you worry about is population loss, and we know, that's already happened to some extent. People want to get their kids into a safe environment. They want to get them back into school, and if they have options with other family, they're going to do that. And we've got to be with those communities for the long haul. We've got to try to take our disaster management programs at the federal and state level and make them work better for people. Often it's a very bureaucratic process. It's hard on people. It's difficult. It takes too long. And we've really got to be willing to kind of rethink all of that.
Yeah, hopefully there will be lessons learned that could be learned from this experience.
There's no question about it. I hear it most often compared to Katrina. But I think the difference is, in Louisiana with Katrina, you don't have the mountains. You've got this flat land and the water spreads out, and that can be incredibly devastating. But in the mountains, what we had was that volume of water being pushed through a funnel.
Right.
And just the devastation that came in its wake left nothing behind in some places.
Yeah, no, it's certainly devastating, and hopefully we'll be able to rebuild quickly. But as we've heard, right, North Carolina's resilient.
Yeah. And the people are resilient.
Yes.
So even in the depths of an event like Helene, the best in people also comes out, and neighbors helping neighbors and strangers on one side of the state helping their fellow North Carolinians on the other side of the state. We've seen a lot of that. It really does restore your faith in humanity.
It certainly does.
Yeah.
The efforts and the outpour of support have been significant, and it's nice to see that people are looking out for their fellow neighbor and their fellow North Carolinian.
Yeah.
Well, I'm glad you're an advocate, right? It's wonderful hearing all the advocacy that you do, and that's a good segue just to talk about the overall engagement and advocacy that the Rural Center does. And so I'm curious, are there any specific policies or initiatives that could impact rural construction or development projects in significant ways? Or
priority for us is the whole area of infrastructure, and infrastructure is a lot. And, and all that infrastructure really dovetails directly into the construction industry, because you got to have water and sewer systems. Yeah. You got to have broadband, which is modern day infrastructure that 25 years ago we were barely thinking about. And now it's a necessity of life, just like water and sewer. And transportation, and as we grow, and there's now nearly 12 million people in the state, how do we more efficiently move people around within the state? All those are important advocacy items to us. We try to look at the unique rural perspective of those infrastructure items. With broadband, for example, that's been our top priority for a number of years. As we did the listening sessions this year, we really were able to hear the fact that we've made a difference over time, that needle has been moved. And people are now much more comfortable with, if the infrastructure isn't already there, it's on its way. Before COVID, and this may be another silver lining of COVID, before COVID, we advocated, worked hard in the General Assembly, had some legislative champions and Representative Dean Arp and Senator Harry Brown, and got a state-based grants program started for broadband. And we fought and worked hard to get $15 million a year put in it. COVID comes along, we have federal response. We think about how should that response be directed. The North Carolina General Assembly is able to make decisions about how those federal dollars get used. And if you add it all up at the federal and state level, we've got $3.5 billion coming at solving the broadband problem. And it's not just an infrastructure problem. It is an affordability issue, and it is also an issue of equity in terms of access. We got to work on all three of those things, but the money is there to solve the infrastructure problem and to get high-speed, affordable broadband to every home and business in the state, regardless of where they're located. The flip side of that is we get the money right, we've got a lot of the policy right. We try to really monitor that to make sure it's working and to see that it's working in the places that are hardest to serve. We focus some of our attention on northeastern North Carolina and southwestern North Carolina, which are the two most underserved regions from a broadband perspective, and try to really make sure that the policy and the money is all connecting to the local community, to their ability to recruit an internet service provider to those places. And we see that we're making progress. And we're going to keep our eye on that. And the clock is ticking on that federal money. And we got to make sure that we use it and get the job done before the clock runs out. So that's one example, really, of how we've taken an issue from advocating for a state-based program and getting the state into the broadband infrastructure game, to COVID coming along, and suddenly there's more money aimed at the thing we've been hollering the loudest about than we could have ever imagined. And now we got to make sure it works, and that we can really connect the dots and make it work for the people in rural North Carolina.
Yeah. Well, that's good. So it is headed in the right direction.
It is. Yeah, it is. Now, Helene's a setback, because, roads and bridges collapse, and what's located beside and under, those bridges and roads, water and sewer, a lot of water and sewer lines, a lot of fiber that's in the ground, along those same roadways. And so it's all got to be rebuilt, and we need to rebuild it in a way that's more resilient.
Well, that's certainly going to be a challenge, right? But hopefully,
it will be.
Hopefully, we'll all figure it out sooner rather than later. But I know it's going to be a big task. I'm curious. You do the annual Rural Summit.
Yeah.
So, can you tell us a little bit more about what that looks like
Sure.
and who attends?
So it's our annual conference. It is the largest rural convening in the state. It happens in 2025. It'll be the last week of March at the Marriott Crabtree here in Raleigh. We always do it at the center of state government because it enables us to get state policy leaders in front of a very large rural audience, talking directly with each other. And so we're very much looking forward to March of 2025. We will be inviting, a new Speaker of the House, the President Pro Tem of the Senate, a new governor, a new lieutenant governor, to really address a pretty broad rural audience. We'll have about 700 people from all rural communities from all across the state. It is an event that has a family reunion type atmosphere to it. It is the time when a lot of those folks get to see each other and spend some time together. It's a 2-day event. We try to connect them with best practices, not only from around our state, but from around the country and sometimes around the world. Models that we think are relevant and replicable, we try to make them available to our audience. We try to bring the best speakers from around the country to put in front of our audience and let them learn from each other.
Yeah, well, it sounds like 2025's summit's going to be really interesting and engaging. So if listeners want to attend, are they able to register on your website?
Yep, they can go to our website and find out. Registration will open right after January 1st. So early in 2025, we'll open registration. And anybody can register, and the registration's open until we fill up. And the last 3 years we've maxed out.
That's great. Well, I'll have to certainly add it to my calendar and try to attend. That sounds great.
Yeah.
So we have a lot of passionate guests that come on our podcast and talk about workforce development, whether through the community college system, where we had Andrew Gardner speak with us, to other leaders. And I know the NC Rural Center has the Homegrown Leaders Program. Can you tell us a little bit more about that and how that's helping with the building leadership across rural communities?
Yeah, so we one of our program areas is leadership. I mentioned our Rural Economic Development Institute, but we recognize that not everybody is able to dedicate themselves to a Raleigh program that is 9 days over 3 months. And so a few years back, we developed a homegrown leaders program that allows us to reach new and emerging leaders in regions. And we also think that regional framework is going to be increasingly important as we kind of move into the future. We're of a size, and the issues we face are of a complexity that you can't solve it one community at a time. And so we really need counties working within natural regions in a way that makes sense to them, really reaching across county lines and community lines to work on some of these big challenges together. And Homegrown Leaders is our leadership development program. It's 3 days. It's pretty intense, but it really grounds them in the region, and it introduces them to each other. One of the questions we had when we did our first Homegrown Leaders training was, if we put these people from around the region, so they live next door to each other, do they know each other? We thought, yeah, they probably are. They probably do know each other. They probably are aware. What we found is no, they're not. But there's real value in them building a network across a region, having a common language about economic development and how to work on it together. And so that's what we've really been trying to forge. So every year we go across the state and we do a homegrown leaders training in Western, Central, and Eastern North Carolina. And over time, we're building that network. It's getting larger. We're seeing what other types of training can we bring to them that are going to be relevant to the challenges that they face.
Yeah, that's great.
And have them do it in a regional framework.
Right. I think that's the key, right? The regional framework where they could certainly relate to each other. Connection and network is everything.
It is.
And so it's really important that they're provided that opportunity.
That's exactly right.
Yeah. Well, looking forward, right, if you had a crystal ball, I'm just curious, the next decade, what's in store for the Rural Center over the next decade?
Well, I think we're at a point, because of the success of some of our small business lending, that we're going to be able to look at expanding some of our rural programming, reaching more people, scaling what we do so that we can do it at even a higher level in the state. So it feels pretty good to be in that place. I think we're going to continue to see some big challenges. I like, with Helene, with workforce development challenges, with our infrastructure challenges. And it's not just true of rural, but the state as a whole. We don't face any small challenges. We've got some pretty big issues hanging out there: housing, workforce development, as far as the eye can see. And that's just a people problem. We've been successful at creating jobs, at building industry and businesses. Now we've got to make sure they have the labor supply that they need in order to get things done. So I think the demand for what we do and serving the rural communities is not going away. If the Rural Center didn't exist, there'd be a group of talented rural economic developers that would be meeting to figure out how to create a rural center. So I feel blessed that we have an organization with almost 4 decades of experience that's in a position to grow and to do more as we move into that future.
Well, I appreciate that. That's a good response. Are there anything short-term, I say short-term, shorter than a decade, in the next 5 years that you feel like are going to be really high priorities to focus on?
I think the workforce development piece, we very much look to, and we're blessed. We have some, and it's everything from cradle to grave, literally.
Yes.
We need to have as many people engaged in the workforce as we possibly can. And for adult parents to be fully engaged, they need to know their kids are taken care of. We've got some childcare challenges all across the state. It's not unique to rural. Rural has some unique aspects to it, but we've got to bring some dedicated focus to that issue on the very early development age. Our K-12 system of public schools. We have the second largest number of public school students in the United States. Only Texas has more rural public school students than
I
the
did
state
not
of
know
North
that.
Carolina does. And so that's really where the rubber meets the road when it comes to early K-12 education, and doing everything we can to prepare them for community college, and not necessarily a 4-year degree, but maybe a 4-year degree. But we've got a great community college system. They're very much pivoting in a way that makes complete sense for the future. We need them to do more. And in order to do more, we've got to change the way that we fund community colleges. We're lucky that we have the private colleges and universities. How many of them, it is amazing how many of them are located in rural places. We have a lot of rural private colleges and universities, but we also have our very strong UNC system. We're dedicating some attention to tech transfer. So how do we take the technology that's emerging from our public universities and turn those into businesses that invest and hire people and put that technology on the ground right here in the state of North Carolina?
Yeah.
I think it's an exciting time. It's a time that's characterized by change and the speed of change. And I don't think there's any going back. It is the world in which we live, and we've got to get used to that pace of change. We've got to help communities adapt to it. It's harder for rural communities, I think, to adapt in that context, but we've got to help them do it, because within those big challenges, there are opportunities.
Yes. So for people listening and businesses listening, if they want to get involved with the NC Rural Center, what's the best way for them to get in touch with you? Is it going through your website, or how would you like them to
Sure,
get more information?
I would encourage them to go to our website, ncruralcenter.org. They can find out everything that I've talked about. They can find out about us in the context of our website. They can meet our team. I welcome them to reach out directly. They can sign up for our newsletter. We do a monthly newsletter that will give them a really good sense of all the things that we're involved with, and connect them to really the best resources when it comes to rural economic development. We'd love to have them come to the Rural Summit. We just finished a series of listening sessions. We'll be doing another road trip, I'm sure, in the not too distant future. We'd love to have some of them sign up for their regional homegrown leaders training, or if they think they're ready, we'd love to have them think about the Rural Economic Development Institute and being a part of that.
Yeah, no, I love that. All right. Well, last but not least, I've got one final question for you. This is Constructing the Carolinas podcast. If there was any one project you would love to see be built in North Carolina, perhaps it's rural North Carolina, what would that project be?
Oh, my gosh.
And it could be anything. It could be fun.
Well, I'll single out one thing that I actually had a conversation about yesterday. One of the real success stories of the last 40 years in North Carolina is the School of Science and Math, which is a high school experience for juniors and seniors in North Carolina. And it was established many, many years ago in Durham. And for many years, Durham was the only School of Science and Math. A few years back, after a lot of work and a lot of laying the groundwork for it, they opened a Burke County Morganton campus of the School of Science and Math. They've now graduated their first senior class. And students from all over the state of North Carolina, high school students, are now having that School of Science and Math experience in Western North Carolina, in Morganton, in a small rural town, and a great rural town. I want to see an Eastern North Carolina School of Science and Math. Maybe it focuses on the ag and pharmaceutical industries. I don't know what it focuses on. Maybe it focuses on the trades. But there's an opportunity to see that grow and take root in Eastern North Carolina. Eastern North Carolina needs some focused attention brought to it. When you think about the foundations, we're blessed in North Carolina to have a really strong network of philanthropy, but a lot of the big philanthropy that's focused on only a part of the state is not focused on Eastern North Carolina, and we need to change that. We need to bring that kind of focused attention to the eastern part of our state. And putting a School of Science and Math in the heart of Eastern North Carolina would be a good place to start.
It does sound like a great place to start. Well, thank you so much. We really appreciate your time today. This was so much fun, and you've got a lot of wonderful information for us, so thank you.
You're welcome. Thank you. I've enjoyed it.
Yeah. Thank you so much to Patrick Woodie for shining a light on the needs and resilience of rural North Carolina. It's clear that these communities are using their strengths, creativity, and new opportunities, like better broadband and innovative small business lending, to write an exciting new chapter. For more information, head on over to ncruralcenter.org. And thank you to our listeners for tuning in to Constructing the Carolinas. Make sure to hit the follow button on your favorite podcast app or YouTube so you don't miss our next episode. And of course, you can keep up with Barnhill's latest projects and initiatives by visiting barnhillcontracting.com and following us on LinkedIn. This podcast is edited and produced by Earfluence. I'm Valerie Bono, and as we continue to construct the Carolinas, I hope this episode inspires you to build, grow, and make an impact in your own way. See you next time.